I'm going to give you, first of all, an overview, an introduction of this afternoon. Then Frans Paul will give a presentation about the Chinese investors. Who really are they? Then we will looking at the real investment. What is invested in EU ports and what are the characteristics? And finally, the impact on national security interests will be presented by Xiaoshu. And then we have discussion. Well, this is one of three pieces of research we produced in the last years. And I think it's a very nice body of work, these three. First, we started with a scenario analysis. What can be expected with respect to Chinese influence in the Netherlands as a logistic country? Four different strategies were produced. The second one is about a framework to assess the impacts of Chinese investment on strategic authority on the broader port infrastructure, and we made a detailed segmentation of different functions in the ports, and the last one will be presented today. The context, it was already quoted by you, of course the EU port strategy. Ports as competitive trade hubs and critical infrastructures for economic security of the EU, ports as public service providers for the resilience of our society, and then, and that is really one-to-one also the report we are going to present, in the EU strategies, it is stated balancing the need for continued investment to increase competitiveness, innovation and sustainability, and the need for limiting security risks related to these investments. Finally, assessing foreign investment thresholds, and that's again a very important issue in our research. We call them tipping points and criteria for foreign influence. Frameworks are needed. Well, the second current development that's very interesting, of course, is the Hutchison MSC BlackRock deal. Yesterday evening I did some search on Google, but it's silent. So but this is very important for also the EU port strategy. Then current developments. We all heard about the 400,000 jobs in Germany claimed to were lost as the effect of Chinese unfair competition. And we all know about the enormous increase in trade. May of this year, 90% extra growth of exports of China. Also a big growth of imports from China, even bigger, measured in dollars, but the maritime industry was really related to these exports. Research questions of this piece of research was, first of all, how does Chinese direct investment in EU-Seaports impact the port's competitiveness? That's the main issue. Is there a tipping point where an increase in Chinese FDI no longer results in a significantly greater likelihood of attracting cargo flows? And does strengthening competitive advantage through attracting Chinese FDI come at the cost of national security interests, or can they amplify each other? Those are the three issues. But first, we go deeper into the characteristics of those Chinese investors. And please, Frans Paul, take over from me.
So we thought that before we really look into the core issue of the research question, the first thing to do for us is to start to look into who are we talking about. So we're talking about Chinese investors, and we have noticed, we have seen that in many publications and research, Chinese investors, whether they are in ports or maybe also in some other sectors and industries, are sometimes viewed as anonymous or interchangeable. Like one Chinese investor is basically the same as another Chinese investor. So we thought, that was my pen. So we thought, let's start by first looking into the background, the identity of the Chinese companies who are doing the investing in European seaports. Who are they, and what is the significance of their Chinese nationality, and what are the differences between those companies? And you can see from the slide, it's three companies who are the main investors, direct investors in European seaports. All three of them are active in container terminal management, so it's investment not in seaports in general or other parts of the port, but specifically these are investors in container terminals. Hutchison Ports, Cosco Ports and CMPort, they also have their own parent companies, they also have their own subsidiary companies, sometimes in Europe. I will say a bit more about this later, but these are the three entities that we focused on. And just to start with very briefly, these three companies have also very different identities and very different distinct histories. Hutchison Ports is a company with a long history that has its roots specifically in the Hong Kong colonial history, Hong Kong colonial background. Cosco Ports, part of Cosco Group, a company that was established in mainland China during the Cold War years. So specifically a company that comes out of Chinese mainland, the People's Republic of China mainland system. And the third one, CMPort, is part of a much bigger company which is called China Merchants, which has also very distinct historical roots that go back to the late 19th century, the late Qing dynasty. It's one of the first modern enterprises that were created in China and which still exist and still very influential. So that already shows you that we are talking about three very distinct different entities. For each of the companies, we looked at various characteristics, but I think the most important ones that I want to talk about here, because we don't have that much time, relate to ownership. Ownership, and then the other issue related to ownership is control. So who owns these entities and who are the controlling stakeholders, the controlling actors behind those entities. So the one that we see here pictured is the ownership background, the ownership structure of Hutchison Ports. Hutchison Ports, of course, is the owner of ECT. So that's the company that is very important to us in the Netherlands, very big player in the port of Rotterdam. But Hutchison Ports also has direct investment in various other European ports, and what you don't see in the slide is also outside of Europe, globally. I'm not going to talk about everything that you can see on the slide, just point out a few things per slide. So this one for Hutchison Port, I just want to point out that it's partly owned by the government, the state, or the government of Singapore. So that's an interesting thing, I think. Singapore has a 20% share in Hutchison Ports. And another notable thing is that the company is listed on the Hong Kong Stock Exchange, and there's the company's parent company, CK Hutchison, is 30% owned by a single person, or you could say that person's family maybe, Li Ka-shing. But it is also 70% owned by shareholders, people who have bought stock on the Hong Kong Stock Exchange. I go quickly to the next one. Here we see the ownership background of Cosco, Chinese state-owned enterprise. So this is well known. I already said that Cosco has its roots in, was established by the Chinese government during the around 1960, at a time when there was no private ownership in mainland China. So it was established as a state-owned enterprise from the beginning. It's still a state-owned enterprise, but still it's more complicated than just a company that is directly and 100% owned by the Chinese central government, which is certainly not the case. Actually, the parent company of Cosco Ports is Cosco Shipping Holding, CSH, based in Hong Kong, which, and Cosco Ports itself is 28% owned by external shareholders, but its parent company is actually majority owned by external shareholders. So by 56% of the ownership of CSH is not the Chinese state, but it is just private or investors who have bought shares in the company on the Hong Kong Stock Exchange. This one is China Merchants, so CMPort. It's only CMPort invests in European ports not directly but through a joint venture with a French company. So CMA CGM, the largest French shipping company, has a joint venture together with CMPort, which is called Terminal Link, which is 51% owned by the French company. So in the background there is the Chinese state, yes, but there is also external shareholders, and there's also the 51% ownership of the French shipping company, which itself is 73% owned by the Sade family, which is a French family that has its origins in Lebanon. Okay, so you can see, yes, it's a state-owned company from China, but it's not that straightforward. There are also other stakeholders involved. And then what we did was this. This is not one of the companies that were part of the research because it's not a Chinese company at all. This is TIL. TIL is also a company that invests in European container terminals. It's not owned by any Chinese actor. It's 60% owned by MSC, which is the largest shipping company, world's largest shipping company, based in Switzerland. And another 30% is owned by a US company, which is part of BlackRock, and another 10% is owned by Singapore. So why did we also look at the ownership structure of a non-Chinese company, which that's something we did for the sake of comparing. So to have a better understanding of not only what are the distinctions between the Chinese investors, but also what makes Chinese investors different from, for instance, a major European investor. Some of the results are summarized in this table. I will just point out that if you look at the ultimate beneficial owner of each company, which is not in the table actually, but if you do that, then you will see then sometimes it's difficult to choose, but in general, yes, it's true that in the case of the Chinese state-owned enterprises, the ultimate beneficial owner is the Chinese central government. In the case of Hutchison Ports, it is the Li Ka-shing and the Li family. And in the case of TIL Group, it is the Aponte family, the people who have, the family who has established MSC as a shipping company, which is from Italy. But what we do see in this table is that if you just look at the formal nationality, it's very different. You can see these companies are registered, for instance, in Bermuda or the Virgin Islands. If you look at the headquarters location, in the Chinese case, it's always Hong Kong. All three Chinese companies have their headquarters in Hong Kong. They have parent companies who have maybe other headquarters, but the companies themselves are in Hong Kong. And TIL Group in Geneva, of course, already mentioned. And then finally, some of them are vertically integrated and others are not. And this part was very much relevant for the part of the research that Bart will talk about in a minute. I just want to point out that from the three Chinese companies, only Cosco Port is part of a bigger entity that has a vertically integrated structure. By this I mean Hutchison and China Merchants are not owners of major shipping companies. Cosco is. But Bart will say more about this in a moment. To conclude, the conclusions, of course, to conclude, a few things I want to remark. It makes quite a difference whether companies are listed on the stock exchange or not. So all three Chinese companies, or technically they're Hong Kong companies, all three are in some way, directly or indirectly, listed on the Hong Kong Stock Exchange, which means that they have an obligation to produce their financial results. They have an obligation to do so, to produce financial reports each year, and so there is a certain degree of transparency. The one European company in our research, MSC's TIL, is a family-owned company which is not listed on any stock exchange, which means that for us as researchers, it's much more difficult to get information on this Switzerland-based investor in European seaports than to get information about the Chinese companies. Another thing is not directly something that we research, but I would say more an implication of our findings is that if you have Chinese, so why does nationality matter? Nowadays, with all the interesting geopolitical developments, if you have a Chinese investor in your ports, this of course comes with certain security issues and risks, which Sjauswerd will talk about shortly. But something that I think a development that came up quite recently, only last year, is that you can also have a Chinese investor in your terminal, container terminals, that leads to complications where the actor that is making the complications itself is not China itself, but is the United States, because this is what we have seen, of course, in Panama, where one of these companies that we researched, Hutchison Ports, also invested, and then the Chinese investment in Panama created difficult relationship between the United States government and the Panamanian government. I'm just saying this, that this is something for us as Europeans, I think. When we talk about Chinese investment and the context in which this takes place, we have to look beyond a purely bilateral relationship between European countries and China, but also look at the bigger geopolitical picture. And then finally, I think the most important conclusion for this chapter, for this part of the research, is that nationality is still the most important feature of the investor, so it does matter whether an investor is Chinese or European or has another nationality, or I'm not talking about the formal nationality, but the ultimate beneficial ownership nationality. It does matter, so yes, the Chinese companies do form a distinct group to look at, but it would, I think it would be wrong, it would go too far to look only at nationality. I think you have to look at nationality, yes, but you also have to look at other features. So that also relates to the policy recommendation that derives directly from this part of the study. For policymakers, for European Union policymakers, I think it's important to look beyond, to look at nationality, yes, but also to look beyond nationality, especially if you want to calibrate your policy for ports, your port strategy, your port policies. If you are somewhere in between, not caring about what China is doing in your ports on the one hand, and totally keeping China out of your ports on the other hand, if you're somewhere in between, which I think is the reality, all major European seaports are somewhere in between. They do allow Chinese investment, but they are not entirely certain as governments how to manage those investments. If you're somewhere in between, I would say then it does make a lot of sense to look at the distinct features of each individual investors, and a few that we mention here that came up in the report. I already mentioned the vertical integration. Of course, also very important is the linkage to the Chinese government. Even if you know there is a linkage to the Chinese government, I think it's important to look exactly how is the company linked to the Chinese government and how that is compared to the other Chinese companies, other potential Chinese investors or actual investors. And also the level or the degree of involvement of non-Chinese government owners. So the examples that I mentioned, certain families or certain external shareholders or certain investment funds who are not from China themselves. And I also already mentioned the degree of or whether a company is listed on a stock exchange. That concludes the part that I wanted to talk about, and I think now it's back to you, Bart.
The second part is Chinese investment and competitiveness of European seaports, and this has been written with my colleague Hilal Kafiroglu. Please stand up, Hilal, that everybody can see you, both in cooperation. Two hypotheses were the main issue at this writing this piece. The first of all, that is related to the productivity and growth effect of foreign direct investment in seaports. China's investment in container terminals can lead to higher productivity, and empirical analysis confirms this. Big data-based data analysis confirms this. Investments have led to an improved competitive position of most ports involved in Chinese FDI. Investment by Chinese state-owned enterprises result in stronger market growth, especially when they operated the shipping line, such as Cosco, as Frans Paul indicated. That was the first hypothesis. The second is tipping point. There is a tipping point, in fact, that the initial competitive advantage related to Chinese investment will become less important over time, making it not really necessary in the end to have this, to consider this investment as important as in the beginning. Those two hypotheses are the main issue. We started with looking at the biggest container ports in Europe. This is the top 25, their rank in 2025. Rotterdam, Antwerp-Bruges are the top 3 together with Hamburg. Then a number of especially Mediterranean ports, Piraeus number 7, and a number of fast-moving growing ports in the lower end. We made case studies on the top 3 ports. Rotterdam, because of its very big involvement with Hutchison Port ECT. Antwerp-Bruges, because it also has quite a lot of investment in important terminals. Hamburg, because of all the fuss about the Tollerort terminal. And then, of course, Piraeus is a very important example of a port really related to Chinese investment. And finally, we had a control port, and that's Gdansk, especially because of the growth of Gdansk by 2,755% since 2007, one of the really big growth ports. So those are our case studies. What is interesting is if you look at this rank, is that, for instance, Piraeus dropped in this table from the number 5 to the number 7 place. It's once a few years ago it was the number 4 port. So that is, I think it's is very interesting, and I come back to that later. This is the case study of the port of Antwerp-Bruges. It's a complicated graph. On the left hand you see total the total container throughput. On the right hand you see throughput related to, for instance, Chinese entities like Cosco. The green line, that is really the total throughput. The red line above, that's the capacity of the port. The orange line, that's the cargo produced by Cosco, the Chinese container and line, the Chinese terminal owner. And you see that the importance of the growth of Cosco in total growth of the port of Antwerp is really big. The growth is even larger than the port as a whole. Then you see the blue line, and the blue line, that's the import of Chinese cargo in the Belgian economy. And that's also growing very robust, and that is mainly also related to the re-export function of Belgium, which is also the case in the Netherlands. Then you see at the bottom, you see the market share of the Chinese investment in ports, in terminals in Antwerp. And that's very low. If you look, that is a share of the total cargo, the total investment in its investment in the total container capacity, and it's below 10%. So that's a very minor action. And in the literature, researchers like Theo Notteboom, they state that this Chinese investment, although it's small, is crucial for the competitive position of the port of Antwerp, being able to become a very strong competitor, for instance, of Rotterdam. So it's small, but it's, considering to the research, it's influential. Then we have here the port of Piraeus. On the back is again the capacity of the port of Piraeus. In the and you see the purple bars. It's the capacity of Cosco in Terminal 2 and 3, which you have also Terminal 1, but this is the big modern container terminals, which is nearly 19%. Then you see total throughput. That's the green line, And there you see the tipping point in 2019. Since 2019, growth is diminishing. And in orange, again, you have the cargo that's directly related to Cosco-related traffic. So here you see a very strong presence of ownership by Chinese parties, but a decreasing port performance. Then you have the case study of the port of Hamburg. And Hamburg, well, there is quite a lot of discussion. Well, the Tollerort terminal was only, that case was only from 2024, so there's not really an effect in Hamburg. Hamburg saw a very strong growth in 2025. There are no statistics available yet of Cosco-related traffic in 2025, but there is an enormous amount of other investment by MSC and CMA CGM in Hamburg. What you see in Hamburg is that the China-related imports are stable and that the total container traffic is also stable. It's not growing. So, and the effect of China is very small of Cosco-related investment, only 3%. And if you look at the discussion, well, you should think that it is that there should be a zero behind those threes. Then you have Gdansk. Gdansk is one of the big growers in the European Port League, and the green line is the growth of container traffic in Gdansk. But Gdansk has no ownership whatsoever of Chinese parties, and you see the blue line. That's the import of container traffic within the port of Gdansk, and it related to the war of Russia with. That's really related to the effect of the war between Russia and Ukraine. So what is clear is that a very big port with diminishing traffic from China is growing, and that, well, there is in the professional journals, there is a relation between Russia, China, and the Polish economy. The big growth of the port of Gdansk is really related to the very strong growth of the Polish economy and the transshipment function for St. Petersburg, for Russia. Then finally, the most complicated, and people say it's a bit busy, this picture, and I agree, it's the port of Rotterdam. On red, we start with the total capacity of the port. You see that it increased dramatically since 2016. The green line is the total container traffic, the container volumes, and you see that it's stagnated since 2018. We are still at the level of 2018 in 2025. Then you see the dotted line, that's the operations, the transshipment of Hutchison Ports that declined because of the new cargo of the new terminals by APM Terminals and RWG in the port of Rotterdam. And then you see the very big share of Hutchison, that's also again purple, in the port of Rotterdam, ownership share, and the limited share, only 8% of Cosco and later the Silk Road Fund and China Merchants. What's also interesting is that the orange line, that's the traffic from Cosco. So where Cosco increased their impact in the port of Antwerp dramatically during the period that they were shareholder, in Rotterdam it's the opposite. In Rotterdam the figure is just the other way around, and well, I got comments that yeah, this is not very dramatic, but if I do it so, then you can really see that that it is really declining the impact of Cosco. And you see also the growth of China-related cargo in the Netherlands. The blue line is growing very fast, and that is related to imports for the Dutch economy, but also the very strong re-export function of the Netherlands. Well, the relationship between Chinese involvement and the competitiveness of European ports is absolutely not linear. Every port has its own profile. And if you have those big data studies of ports globally, then usually they have quite a lot of ports in developed countries like Now you cannot say that about Greece, but at the moment of acquiring Piraeus, then it was in a difficult position, and that's a quite different story like mature ports of Antwerp and Rotterdam. The case study shows that Chinese investment only leads to increased competitiveness under certain conditions. That's about what Frans Paul already told about the relation between a terminal owner related to a shipping line and a logistics service provider. General logistics developments and investment and strategies of non-Chinese companies are more important for the growth of most ports than Chinese investment. If you look at Germany, then CMA, CGM and MSC invested nearly in 40% of the total port capacity. So that is much more important than the 3% of Tollerort. Then the case studies reveal that the shares of Chinese investment with growth potential as indicated in the literature, the Cosco model, is usually less than 10% of the total port handling capacity, with the exception of Piraeus. No clear tipping point for diminishing impact of Chinese investment could be identified, except again for Piraeus. And in general, the occurrence of a tipping point also applies to terminal investment from non-Chinese sources. So if you see it, the hottest terminal in the region at the moment, Tanger-Met, well, why is it growing that much? Because of all kinds of new investment, and in Piraeus is already concerning innovations in Old Port. To conclude, some policy recommendations. Even with a minority stake, security risk exists. It's not primarily the presence of Chinese capital, but the depth of influence and control powers. If those companies have a share in a terminal operation, that matters. And a state-owned enterprise can be more dependent on a major EU container port than the other way around. Trade with China is independent of the ownership of terminals, and ports are primarily seen as trade facilitators. And export is at the moment extremely important for China because of the problems in their home market. That means that there is ample room to impose requirements on the maximum ownership level of a terminal or other requirements without this affecting anti-competitive behavior by state-owned enterprises. And finally, security risks are not only associated with foreign direct investment, but also with other types of foreign investment, such as lodging the Chinese port community system. That was my presentation. Well, the final word is to you, Sjoosje. Thank you.
And the last part of our report is related to national security risks, because we looked from the perspective of ports have to balance both economic security concerns and national security concerns. So we wanted to look at how are these interrelated, and does economic competitiveness come at the cost of national security? Now, how did we define national security? We looked at a definition from the Dutch government, from their security strategy for the Kingdom of the Netherlands, published I think in 2023. And it has 6 security interests that it defines. Economic security, territorial security, international legal order and stability, social and political stability, ecological security, and physical security. Now, if you're really interested in this, read the report, because we show an overview of the following tables that give a specific definition of these. I'll just show them very quickly here, but it's a lot of text. You can read them in the report on what exactly the definitions then are, because each of those 6 interests is subdivided into several impact criteria. So I looked at those impact criteria to see what are the relevant security interests. And we based our research on desk research, but also on interviews. And I would also like to thank Steven Verburg and Ellen Schepers for their part in contributing to this research. Now, what are the conclusions then? We saw that there are 4 ways in which Chinese investments in the European seaports can negatively impact national security, so related to the risk side. First of all, it's related to the international position of the nation and strategic autonomy. And there's several ways in which Chinese FDI is related to strategic autonomy. For example, the dependence that it gives a port on this Chinese investment. And the increased control that it gives a port gives a Chinese investor on the port. Another topic that came up a lot is digital infrastructure integrity or data concerns, where there is a concern that's often debated that investing in a port could give either insight into sensitive data that could be used for competitive advantage. So if you're a Cosco and you've invested in several ports in Europe, you can take all that data and then perhaps you could use it for competitive advantage. Another risk that's related to digital infrastructure integrity is related to sensitive data concerning military transport or dual-use goods. Then the third security interest is related to economic security. So how much economic power are you giving a Chinese investor? And the fourth risk is related to state sovereignty. And this is very much related to how high is this level of Chinese investment. In the case of Piraeus, for example, the investment doesn't only just cover part of the terminal, but also includes the port authority. And if this is the case, that means that a Chinese investor has influence over the port's future, and the country has less influence over the port's future. Now, these are all maybe sounding a little bit hypothetical, so it's good to give a little bit of a few examples to show the impact and the likelihood also of these criteria, because it's important to say that a lot of these risks aren't only related to Chinese FDI and aren't only dependent on the presence of Chinese FDI. For example, if you look at data concerns or cyber risks of sabotage of a port, you don't necessarily need to have Chinese investment if you're a non-benign actor and want to disrupt the port. You don't necessarily need that. But it's good to show some examples to show how these factors are indeed relevant. And an important one is the CK Hutchison investment in Panama ports that was already mentioned, where you could see that there was a Chinese investment from Hutchison into Panamanian ports. And CK Hutchison decided that they wanted to sell 80% of their port portfolio. So not just Panama, but also a lot of ports worldwide. This was noticed by the American government, who hurrahed and made a big public deal about it, saying, yeah, we're getting back the ports in Panama. And what you then saw was that the Chinese government started getting worried. And how could you see this? You could see that the Chinese government was warning CK Hutchison whether this proposed deal was actually following competitiveness rules in China. And you could also see that after Panama said, okay, we do not want the Chinese port investment anymore, we're giving it to European companies instead, and these are Maersk and MSC, that then those two European companies were summoned by the Chinese government. And it's not entirely clear what they were summoned for, but the timing suggests that it was directly related to this incident. And this is a conflict that's still ongoing, which shows the security risks that are involved, even for Hutchison Ports, which, as Frans Paul already presented, is actually less close to the Chinese state than the two other Chinese companies. Another example is the port of Piraeus, where specifically related to data security concerns, where the port of Piraeus could not join the European Ports Alliance. And this Ports Alliance is a collaboration between ports to work together on drug trafficking. And one of the ways that they wanted to do this is to share more data with each other. And one of the rules of being able to join this alliance was a certain level of foreign involvement, which meant Piraeus was excluded from this alliance because there was too much Chinese investment in there. Another example from the port of Piraeus is that Cosco wanted to unroll a port community system, the Hellenic port community system. And Greece itself said, we don't want this to happen because it might give too much insight to Cosco in sensitive data or data that they could use for competitive reasons. So there you could see that the concerns of digital infrastructure integrity led to an initiative from Cosco not happening. Another example that's relevant to mention is actually related to this broader context of US-China geopolitical tensions. The example is that there is increased pressure from the American government to its allies worldwide, so also in Europe, to decrease investments from China. And you could see this in the port of Piraeus again, one of the cases that keeps coming up, where the American ambassador on TV said that they would really like to see the Chinese investments there reduced. And that was a public statement, but behind closed doors, there was also pressure to decrease Chinese investments. And the question, of course, for ports with a lot of Chinese investments is, what if that happens to our country? What do we do then? Because if you were to reduce then Chinese investments, there's a risk that the Chinese government would get upset, like it did with the Panamanian ports, and would get involved. A specific example of this happening is actually in Australia, a Darwinian port, so the port in Darwin, where the port wanted to reduce the level of Chinese investment. And as a consequence, the Chinese investor and the Chinese government were threatening with countermeasures. This is also still unfolding, so it's unclear how this will end, but it shows that this discussion of national security concerns is happening in a broader geopolitical context. Now, to be fair, we also looked at national security benefits. So in what way can Chinese FDI benefit national security interests? And one of the ways is interdependence, which I think Frans Paulo or Bart already mentioned, that it would give a Chinese investor and thereby state influence an added interest in not upsetting relations too much because you're so reliant on this specific port where there is an investment. Another concern is related to the vitality of the economy, so does it increase competitiveness or not? And here you can really hear that a lot of different interests are intermingled, right? Economic security, strategic autonomy, these are all interlinked with each other. And sometimes you can also see that different stakeholders argue with different security interests. So in the case of Hamburg, you could see that the port itself said, we need a Chinese investment because of economic competitiveness concerns, and the EU, several EU parties and several parties within the government of Germany were worried about data security concerns or other national security risks. So here you can see that these interests sometimes clash with each other between member states, but also within member states. The Dutch government has spent a lot of effort also in talking to different member states in the lead up to the European port strategy. And there they discussed their view of different security risk and competitiveness concerns. And you could really see that different member states had different emphases in what they found important. For example, ports in the south of Europe then said, well, if we start getting stricter with ports, what does that mean for our competitors that are just outside the EU? Aren't we then getting outcompeted? Now, for the conclusions, the good news is there are more security risks than there are benefits, but these can be managed. So it's important to say Chinese investments in European seaports should not in principle be avoided or reduced just because they're Chinese. There are risks related to their Chinese investor, yes, but it doesn't mean that we should just block all Chinese investments. Also because of the risk that I mentioned, that if you do reduce Chinese investment, it could lead to another Chinese retaliation. The overall investment portfolio matters, so not just individual cases, and that's why it's important to look from a European perspective and not just from the perspective of an individual port. US-China tensions as a factor I mentioned, that it's not just, the risks are not just related to the Chinese investment per se, but also the geopolitical context in which they occur. And the specific magnitude of the risk, and if you're really interested, please go read the report where I've written about it in detail, but the magnitude of the risk depends on the level of investment, whether there is or isn't control over the port authority, which Chinese company it is, are there other investments, and are there options to reduce or and or replace Chinese investments? Because if there isn't an alternative, then what are you going to do? Now, the policy recommendations that flow out of this is, on the one hand, European coordination is really necessary to manage these risks and to make sure that also you get more reciprocity in the relationship with countries like China. This is something that was specifically mentioned also in the Council conclusions on the European port strategy, this requirement of reciprocity. Because if you look at the bigger picture, it's much easier for Chinese companies to invest in European ports than the other way around. It's also important to have a country-agnostic approach. And this is also related to diplomacy, where maybe you don't necessarily name who you want to target by name, even though you are taking measures to reduce security risks related to a specific actor. Then finally, it's important to say this report, because of the research question, focused only on investment. But previous reports that we did also focused on other types of foreign involvement, such as technology, software. And for ports and for port coordination, we have to take this bigger perspective. Looking at, for example, the use of Chinese technology, there's a lot of discussion of the use of NUCTEC scanners, or the use of cranes from ZPMC, which is also a Chinese company. There's concerns related to using port community systems such as lodging, which is directly related to the Chinese government, but also the broader context of there is a trade deficit between the EU and China. And right now it's, I think it was 1 billion a day that the latest data showed. Now, to end, before we go to the discussion, we have some suggestions for future research, because as you've probably seen, we are port nerds. We love this topic, and we've seen a few topics that we think could use more research. The first one is the role of lodging and port community systems in Europe. How should the Netherlands and the EU respond to China's role in port community systems? And this is related to those data security concerns. Another topic is related to the NSR, or with the Northern Sea Route, the Arctic, which is now a hot topic again. What geopolitical and economic implications does China's increasing involvement in the development of the Northern Sea Route have for the Netherlands? How should the Netherlands respond to this? And then more directly related to this research, a framework for assessing the implications for EU strategic autonomy and responding to changes of Chinese terminal ownership in the EU. Because what we've seen is often terminal ownership changes because of changes in the head or the parent company somewhere up the line. And sometimes that is or isn't noticed or isn't picked up. How do you respond to these changes? And then finally, something we would also like to get into in the discussion, how to operationalize the EU port strategy. There is now an EU port strategy, hooray, but there is still a lot of questions on, okay, what now? How do we operationalize it? How do we balance the different concerns of different member states? And then specifically, because we are Dutch, we are interested in the impact on and the role for the Netherlands. And then now, before we go to the discussion, and we also stop the live recording, would also like to thank Bart Kuipers, because this is I think the final report that we will be able to do with each other before his pension starts. Thanks.